So if you could please introduce yourself. I know this panel is really short, so first up, it would be fantastic for you to introduce yourself.
I'd love to. Hi, everyone. I am Anemone. I come from the Museum for the United Nations, UN Live. We are an agile extension of the UN, and we really try to connect people across the world and bring them closer to the UN's values and goals. We do it through conversation. We do it through popular culture, because that's really where you can open people's hearts and minds. That's the shortest way I can talk about what UN Live is and does.
So tell us more about global we and why it's important.
Yeah, so in our organization, we really work to create a new sense of global belonging. So I don't need to belabor the point that we are seeing intertwined crises across the world, right? At this point, that's why we're all here at COP28. But what we are also seeing is really a crisis of empathy, a deficit of empathy in this world. And that's what we think is one of the greatest challenges in order to really create that sense of agency, to create that sense of action that we need with people across the world. So this empathy crisis really seen both in the more and deeper polarization we see across the world. There was a global crisis report that came out not long ago that said that anger across the world is on the rise. There's a report not long ago coming out that in the population of in the US, young people actually have 40% less empathy now than 40 years ago. That's quite a stark number. So there's a crisis in empathy, but there's also something that exacerbates it when it comes to especially the climate crisis, which is the fact that voices of the people who are most affected by the consequences of the climate crisis are not being heard to the extent that's needed. So the solutions and the understanding and the stories that really sit with the people who know most, who are the expert when it comes to climate crisis, are not being surfaced to the extent that's needed. So that's really exacerbating this challenge that we all have. And that's what we're working on when we say we want to seek to establish a global we. It's a sense of I belong to this world, I can act for this world, and I understand that we are all in this very deep held crisis together. That's where we can find hope.
I definitely noticed what you're saying about around a lack of empathy since COVID a couple of years ago. In my organization, we regularly do filming, and we go up to people in the public and we ask, hey, can we have a couple of minutes of your time? And we do some surveying and data collection. And over the last couple of years, I've definitely noticed people just less empathetic. Do you think COVID has globally had a role in that? And why do you see that trajectory going in this negative direction?
I think the challenge is when things get hard, we sometimes, instead of actually pulling together in the bus, which is what we should be doing, we pull each other apart, or we pull ourselves to the side and think more about what each of us need and how we create livelihoods for ourselves. So that's a natural sort of way of acting. But I would actually say that the COVID crisis was something that also showcased an enormous opportunity when it comes to this sense of global we and this sense of global belonging. Because what happened in the COVID crisis was that all of us was all of a sudden in the same boat. We had the same challenge that we need to deal with, and we had the same lived experience of that fear that we were all sitting with at that time. It's actually a very powerful thing that happened at that time, because it creates a sense of knowing that we are all experiencing something that's similar. That actually holds potential, I think, because that means that when we know that even if I'm in South Africa, or if I am somewhere in an island state, or if I'm in the global north, I still have met this particular challenge, and we faced up to it to a certain degree at least. So I think there's actually opportunity within that type of challenge, and that's where we should also find the hope that if we do act together, there's a way to circumvent some of the challenges we might face in the future.
Building more global belonging and bringing the many people into the conversation is something that's extremely hard. How do you go about doing this?
So we obviously can't do that overnight, and it's a long-term mission. But what we've done is we've said we got to start with bringing more people and also more underrepresented voices into the conversation. So we created this program that was built on 3 legs. First off, we said, how can we bring very tangible conversations across people, across borders, across different socioeconomic groups, and so on. And we created a network to do that, where we start with the very sort of, the very basic things that we all share as human beings. So it could be how we commute to work, or it could be how we go about our day. We start the conversations with something that we can all relate to. Instead of starting with the big and scary climate numbers or things that require technical expertise, we really tried to say, how do we start with the things that we share as human beings? And we brought 10,000 people into these conversations, and I will show you a little clip that shows how we've done that. But we set up an infrastructure around the world with containers. It's just repurposed shipping containers, but you can go into them, and then you can have a real-time, life-size conversation with somebody who is in a completely different area of the world. We worked with fantastic partners and colleagues in refugee camps in Erbil, Iraq, or Naki Valley, Uganda, on Barbados, the island state, like areas where the lived experience of the climate crisis is very clear, and the consequences are very clear. So we did that, and then we also said we need to also bring this to decision makers. We need to bring it to the people who have the formal authority to move the needle. So last year at COP, for example, we brought this container directly into the Blue Zone, and we had delegates, business leaders, the people who run around in suits in the negotiation rooms, to come into conversation with people who are beamed in directly from some of the areas in the world that are most affected by climate change. Because we've all become so numb to the numbers. You know, there are 450 human-driven climate disasters last year. There are millions and hundreds of millions of people who are displaced right now because of the climate crisis. All of these things we see and hear all the time. But what really matters is the stories behind the human beings who are living and seeing this challenge. And we had leaders go into those conversations and come out and say, this is probably the most impactful thing that I've done here, because it actually is a human being, and I can't look away from a face that tells this story. And that's quite powerful. So if you don't mind, then maybe we can show the short clip that actually is also bringing in some of these voices that I would really like to bring forth here.
Be very honest here, sometimes it gives me a lot of anxiety. Why are we not being able to do the things that we should to combat climate change and lead to a better future for all of us and for the people who will come after me?
The sea levels are rising, but the people that are most affected in the beginning is the people that have nothing to do with this whole mess. Small island nation, the highest point of their country is 6 meters tall, and now they have to move.
We'd go to like 4 to 6 hours, depending on what level we are, without electricity.
Every day.
The beautiful part about that is that it's getting people to be more proactive in exploring alternative energy supplies such as solar.
To show more empathy and love for each other. I think we need to show that as well to the natural world, because I feel like many people fail to recognize that we don't exist separately.
I think that last statement is super powerful.
How did you go about editing that and selecting those moments?
Yeah, I mean, we have so much wonderful material from these conversations, and obviously we can't ask anybody to watch all of the recordings that we have. But what we did was actually we created a collaboration with a center out of MIT called the Center for Constructive Communication. And then we transcribed, so we recorded, transcribed, analyzed all of these conversations that were held between people and tried to understand, where does the gravity of the conversation really sit? What are the things that come out? How do people actually react and respond to coming into a conversation with people that are maybe very, very different from themselves and have very different local experiences with climate change? And then we put it all into what is now a publicly available library, where you can actually go and see this analysis from an AI machine that sort of understands these words are put together, these are the things that come forth. And a lot of it, I will say, is around sort of what emotions are brought about when we talk about climate change, because it's really an emotional topic for the people who are feeling it the most.
And if you were to summarize, what are the key takeaways?
Yeah, so that's hard because we had such a wide and broad discussion, but I would say really 4 things. So first of all is that climate change is real and felt, but it's felt in very different ways. So the people coming in had very different experiences. The second is there's a lot of anger and frustration. The third is there's an abundance of hope. And the fourth thing I would say is more around our conversation, that we need to shift the narrative and the way that we talk about climate change. So if I can quickly go into those. So for the first one, people come into this conversation with very different experiences. Some of us have mostly the experiences of reading it through newspapers or seeing sort of what is happening out there in the world. Others are literally coming in and saying, this has had direct effects on the livelihoods of my family. So as an example from Barbados, we had Bevany come in and say, sugarcane needs a certain amount of water per cycle, but we have had first floods, then droughts, and it has really big consequences for people in small island states. So that's just an example, right? You have people come in and share how this has impacted their lives or their families, and that is very powerful in the storytelling. Then the second thing is, and I think we see that with climate activists around the world, there's a growing sense of anger and frustration that sits with knowing that this is an issue and not experiencing that it's taken to the accelerated action that's needed by particularly governance and governments, both in local government but also in national governments, and sometimes even also with fellow countrymen and the people around them. So there's this growing sense of a collective call for these structural shifts. But then thirdly, I think we're seeing so much hope. So many people coming in and saying we have practical solutions, whether it's around sort of figuring out how can we lower plastic pollution or sort of the plastic issue, saying how we collect plastic on the beach in Indonesia, or it's around creating more sustainable products, or it's around actually mobilizing across their local communities. There's so many stories of solutions, and that we've seen actually helps build more action. So there's a ripple effect of sharing solutions that actually builds new action. And that's really powerful. And then the last thing I would say, which is really around the entire sort of work that we have done in this space. We need to all be clear on how we talk about climate change to not make it an alien topic for people around the world. There is such strength in creating the stories, in creating the very clear narratives around how we're experiencing this and what it means for everyday people. And we need to focus on that in the way that we communicate this challenge. Let's not assume that we get people engaged just by talking about the technicalities or only doing it through numbers. We need to really give this crisis a face and a name.
Thank you so much. We've got a few more minutes. Is any kind of closing remarks, any other messages that you want to talk about?
I think I'll bring one more quote, if I may, from a participant that really showcased how this narrative building makes such a difference to him. And this was somebody from Mexico that was in conversation with Brazil. And he said, I believe a starting point to imagine a better society is to get inspired and feel responsible by talking to the indigenous groups in Brazil. Their relationship with nature was nothing like the relationship we have with nature here. Nature was a relative to them. So everything they did was extremely sustainable, nothing was wasted. What an example to be inspired from. And that's just, there's so much power in understanding how others see nature, engage with nature, and commit to nature. And I think that is exactly what this type of conversation can bring about and why it's powerful. And we need to amplify it. We need to bring it to the decision makers. We need to get everybody engaged, because we can't technically fix our way out of this challenge. We need to actually also create the change with the people around the world and move people's hearts and minds.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. And lastly, where can people find out about your work? Have you a website?
We do. We talk
We're
about our
live recording here, so maybe it's a good opportunity.
Amazing. Please go and visit our website. We're museumfortheun.org. And we would love to connect and speak with partners around the world. We do that all the time, and we can't get too many involved. So thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Klaus.